Okay, thank you. And good evening. My name is Betty Tonsing. I want to welcome you back. We are in the middle of our 2022-2023 program year for distinguished speakers. And we have a tremendous lineup for the remainder of the year, which we'll talk more about later, but we have a wonderful speaker this evening that so many of you signed up for, and I know you're excited. So I'll keep my remarks very brief. 1 year ago, you might remember exactly 1 year ago, I believe this month, we had the Ukrainian ambassador to the United States, Oksana Makarova, and I remember every morning, every night I'd go to bed, and every morning I woke up thinking, please, please, Putin, stay out of Ukraine. We were excited about having the ambassador. And the discussion, of course, 1 year ago was, will he invade? And there were just a lot of assumptions as to what might happen if we did. And we were absolutely thrilled that she came and joined us. This is an incredibly busy woman at that time, and she did. And here we are 1 year later, and we are indeed going to talk about Ukraine again. We have this evening Dr. Fiona Hill, who is with the Brookings Institute. And I know many of you are here this evening with us because you know who Dr. Hill is. There's a lot going on. This is a very timely and a very urgent topic. These are the topics we like to have. This one in particular, though, is really urgent. With a new Congress, there's a threat perhaps that some may want to forestall any more funding. And the question remains, what will happen? These are some of the things that Dr. Hill will speak about this evening. And who is winning? What is winning? Is it the determined will of an authoritarian? Or we would hope an even more determined, I'm sure that it is a more determined will of a people seeking to keep their freedom. And of course, democracy, many of us feel, hangs on the line. And I think with that, I'm going to take it straight away to Ray Montano, who's going to introduce our speaker. We're going to start our evening, and I will see you at the end of the evening. Ray.
Hey, thank you, Betty. So I'm Ray Montagno, and I'm currently the president of the Indiana Council on World Affairs. And on behalf of our board of directors, I'd like to welcome you all. For those of you who may be new to us, I just want to give you a little background. ICWA is an educational, nonpartisan, nonprofit organization with an all-volunteer board. We host a lot of timely events on important international topics, and we try to promote respectful dialogue. So there's going to be an opportunity later for you to ask questions, and we certainly encourage you to do that. We're a membership organization, and while all our programs are open to the public, we'd like you to consider joining us as a member to support our programs that are focused on U.S. foreign policy and foreign affairs. And I would like to thank everybody who signed up as members so far, and all of those of you who have made donations to help us support our work. Additionally, we're always interested in growing our board. If anybody is interested in working with our organization, please feel free to contact us through our website. We've actually been in business for over 68 years now, so we have a long history of providing a dialogue about international topics here in Indiana. So we can begin now, and I'd like to take this time to introduce Dr. Hill. Dr. Hill is a senior fellow at the Center of the United States and Europe in Foreign Policy at the Brookings Institute. She recently served as Deputy Assistant to the President and Senior Director for European and Russian Affairs on the National Security Council from 2017 to 2019. From 2006 to 2009, she served as a National Intelligence Officer for Russia and Eurasia at the National Intelligence Council. She's authored a couple of books. There Is Nothing for You Here, Finding an Opportunity in the 21st Century, and Mr. Putin, Operative in the Kremlin. Prior to joining Brookings, Fiona was a Director of Strategic Planning at the Eurasia Foundation in Washington, D.C. from 1991 to 1999, and she held a number of positions directing technical assistance and research projects at the Harvard University John F. Kennedy School of Government, including Associate Director of Strengthening Democratic Institution Project, Director of the Project on Ethnic Conflict in the former Soviet Union, and coordinator of the trilateral study of Japanese, Russian, and U.S. relations. So Dr. Hill, we'd like to welcome you to Indiana and the Indiana Council on World Affairs.
Thanks so much, Ray. I really wish I was in Indiana, so it's nice to be there virtually, or with everybody virtually.
Well, good. So we'll just kind of have this as hopefully a relatively informal discussion, and hear your insights into some of these issues that a lot of our participants are probably thinking about. So, just to start with, how much of this invasion is Putin alone, or is based on the history of the region? Do most Russians believe that Ukraine is part of Russia?
That's really a tough question to answer at this precise moment, because when you're in a wartime scenario, people tend to get swept along with things, and people's views evolve and change. And I think if you'd asked people, a year ago in Russia, whether they'd expect that they would be at war with Ukraine, they would have also been met with incredulity. Because certainly, a lot of people in Russia, 11 million people in Russia identify themselves as Ukrainians. Many, many more have Ukrainian heritage, mixed heritage, as many people do in other parts of the world. For people of Putin's generation, there is definitely the view that Ukraine and Russia are in the same frame. And in fact, Putin's been writing about this for several years now. And he, of course, is for the cohort of people who came out of the Soviet Union. So he was born in 1952. So if you look at the kind of people who's his age and above, or just below, I'm in my late 50s. So, I remember, the Soviet Union. So if let's just sort of take, the people who are in their late 50s all the way through to Putin's age group, they probably have a really hard time getting their heads around the fact that Ukraine is a foreign country anyway. But it's been 30 years since Ukraine got its independence. And the younger generation of Russians would probably say something different. Yeah, of course, Ukraine's independent. Anybody who's in their 40s and below has got used to the fact that Ukraine's an independent country. But what you're seeing is Putin spending an awful lot of time, particularly over the last decade, since the annexation of Crimea and the starting off of the war in the Donbass. I mean, remember, we've been in this for about a decade now, making a kind of case for why Ukraine belongs with Russia. And saying that basically the West wants to take Ukraine, the United States wants to take Ukraine, that this is a battle for the future of Russia over some of its key territories. And once the war started, you started to see also an evolution in some of the opinion polling. We've seen 1 million people, by the way, leave Russia in this year. When Betty was talking about how much has changed in a year, 1 million people have left. And those will be people who don't want to take part in this war one way or another. And there are many others within who probably don't either. And we know from individual and small group acts of protest, sabotage, the people who've been swept up in jail right now, there are a lot of people who do not agree with this war, but feel that they really don't have a lot of ways of making their point heard. And polling seems to show that there seems to be a majority of support. But again, in a wartime, if somebody asks you, what do you think about your leader? What do you think about your state? What do you think about the war? People tend to be generally going with the trend of where they think the direction is. So I think, at this point, as we always see, things take on a bit of a life of their own. And it's a question, that could be maybe asked in another way about how many people will really mobilize behind this war and do what it takes for Russia to win. And I don't think that Vladimir Putin himself can answer that question right now either.
Before we go on here, I just want to remind everyone, if you have questions, we'll have a Q&A session after we finish the initial round of questions. And if you would like, use the chat and send your questions to me, Ray Montagno. My name is on my picture there. And if you would like to ask a question personally, I will call on you and you can unmute yourself and ask the question. Okay, thank you. Kind of following along with that, are there many Russians living in Ukraine and, among the Ukrainians, not only in Crimea, but throughout Ukraine? I presume there are quite a few Russians. Are these people potential threats to the long-term security of Ukraine, or will they be brought along? Are there institutions in the Ukraine that will support their kind of transition into a Ukrainian democracy?
You see, so this is also one of those other contentious issues, because how do you find a Russian? So is it somebody who speaks Russian? Is it somebody who purely identifies themselves as Russian, or is it somebody who is a Russian citizen? So a citizen of the Russian Federation actually holds a passport And of course, there were people who were citizens of the Russian Federation who held passports. And in fact, in the Donbass region, which has been, the focal point of conflict since 2014, the Russians were handing out passports to people, on a easy, application. The same in Crimea. In Crimea, there actually were a lot of people who were Russian citizens who actually worked in and around the Russian Black Sea Fleet, which continued to lease the ports of Sevastopol and some of the others since the Soviet period. But Russia has pretty much declared that anyone who speaks Russian in the states of the former Soviet Union, so it's like 25 million Russian speakers outside of Russia, places like Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Ukraine, Belarus, Moldova, Armenia, Azerbaijan, for example, that they're all Russians. But not all of these people applied for Russian citizenship. Many of them applied for the citizenship of the countries in which they were resident after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And I think we all should know that language isn't necessarily the indicator of your identity, right? We're not all English, even though we speak English. Now, I actually might be, British as well as a US citizen. I'm a dual citizen, but actually my heritage is pretty mixed. I'm, Scots, Irish, Welsh, English, and a bit more. And you go to Britain and ask a Scot, "Are you English?" Because you just speak English. Oof, really get a backlash. And of course, Welsh. A million, people strong. A lot of people. We remember Wales was in the World Cup, the soccer cup. And they were singing their anthem in Welsh, that we're still here, but not everyone in Wales speaks Welsh. And in Ireland, I'm sure there's quite a few people out there in the World Affairs Council of Irish Heritage, and not everybody speaks Irish. And certainly, kind of Scotland's whole identity and push for independence has not been based on the Scottish Gaelic language. So what Putin is basically saying is, if you speak Russian, and I identify you as a Russian, including all the people in Ukraine who happen to be Russian speakers, then you are a Russian. And that's really, what this war is about in many respects. Russian speakers in Ukraine who want to identify as being Ukrainian and don't want to be told that they're Russian, just like Americans didn't want to be told that they were British, back in the day of the American Revolution. So we're in a way, this conflict is all about people identifying themselves as how they want to be identified, not how they're identified on the basis of language, because Russian, being an imperial language, spread all the way across the old Russian Empire and as well across the Soviet Union.
So you think there's any threat that is inherent in these folks, existing in Ukraine? Somehow you got muted there. Amy? You're muted also, Amy. I can't hear you. Can you ask?
Suddenly I'm unmuted, and actually, probably just while I was muted, because my teenager's screaming in the background and set the dog off barking. So that was kind of cacophony going on there at the same time. I don't know whether you'd have heard it or not, but I just have to open the door and yell. The threat of interruption. Look, it's basically, if we go back to the 1990s, the early 1990s, and the dissolution of the Soviet Union into all the constituent republics and independent states we see today. When the Russian Federation became standalone and we recognized it's a successor state to the Soviet Union, by 1992, Russia had basically said it had the right to protect Russian speakers in what it was then calling the near abroad. So the threat's been there right from the very beginning, that Russia would try to exert its authority and political influence and even go to war on behalf of people it deemed to be Russian, whether they wanted it to intervene on their part or not. So we're actually seeing the kind of consequences of something that's been playing out since the 1990s.
So kind of follow up on that a little bit. How did Putin actually rise to power? And is his power absolute, or are there other power players in the Kremlin?
There are other power players in the Kremlin around Putin. There's a cohort of people that he has emerged among. His path to power is quite murky. He's been in power, of course, 23 years now. So, we've had a long time to contemplate him. But as we start to answer that question, Ray, one of the books you referenced, Mr. Putin Operative in the Kremlin, that I wrote with a colleague from Brookings, Clifford Gaddy, and there was a couple of other books written around the same time, Asher Gessen's Man Without a Face, and everybody was trying to figure out exactly the answer to that question. How did he rise to the top? How did someone like him end up as president of Russia? And one might argue that if it hadn't been for the collapse of the Soviet Union, this never would have happened. I mean, basically, he has a not so stellar career in the KGB, which he joins straight after university back in the 1970s. He's stationed abroad in Dresden in East Germany during that time. And then when the Soviet Union falls apart, he comes, basically back to Russia, and he gets a job as the deputy to the mayor of St. Petersburg, who's his old law professor from Leningrad State University. And it's that connection that leads him to the Kremlin, because there are people that he worked with in the mayor's office, is the office of Anatoly Sobchak, who's the first democratically elected mayor of St. Petersburg, that offer him a job in the Kremlin when Sobchak isn't re-elected as mayor. So there's a kind of a, job for the boys, everyone trying to look out for themselves. But his initial job is way behind the scenes in the Kremlin Property Agency. And what he seems to have done is just take advantage of that opportunity and basically let everybody think that he's their guy. And one of the reasons that he was then selected to be president by Boris Yeltsin, who was resigning at the end of 1999, was that he thought that Putin would look after his interests. And all those other power brokers in the Kremlin thought that Putin was somebody they could manipulate. Well, we've all learned in the last 23 years that they were wrong. And that in fact, Putin's the kind of person who was taking advantage of somebody who was operating in obscurity to basically accumulate all kinds of influence and ultimately power, and then really manipulate other people. But it's still a real mystery exactly how he was, selected in the time and why ultimately he was selected over other people. But it comes down to the fact that other people thought that he was their guy, that he could manipulate, and there could be the power behind the throne kind of thing.
Interesting. We in the United States, we tend not to be very aware of some of the wider geopolitical ramifications of the war here. How are other countries impacted by what's going on here? Who are the winners and losers in this? I mean, we read about China and India in terms of their kind of fence straddling with respect to this war. What's going on geopolitically with respect to the war?
Well, first of all, this is an absolute disaster for Europe. Europe over writ large is a loser, because every mechanism, every institution that was created after World War II to prevent something like this from ever happening again has obviously failed. I mean, this is the third great power conflict in Europe. You can call it World War III, as I have done sometimes because of the larger implications of it. But it's the third great power conflict in Europe over territory in a century. First two were Germany, and then this is Russia doing exactly the same as Germany did in World War I and World War II. And when you have these kind of conflicts, it changes the whole world. But Europe thought it was living in perpetual peace. I mean, we've been having arguments with Europeans for years now about them not stepping up in NATO, 2% of GDP, being spent on armaments because they didn't think they had to. And now for Europe, this is an absolute massive shock to the system. Now, if you were Poland, the Baltic states, and some of the other countries on Russia's periphery, just said, yes, we told you so. We said this was always going to happen. But if you're Germany and France, you're in a bit of a state of shock. And Spain and Portugal and others further afield, how can this also be happening again? And, so many countries now are having to grapple with this. And Germany is definitely a loser from this conflict as well, because Germany had basically made a long-term bet on cheap Russian gas and oil from Russia to basically keep fueling its economy. And the whole German economic miracle, I mean, we always think of Germany as an incredibly prosperous country. But, 20 years ago, Germany wasn't doing so well. And it was really that bet on Russian gas and a very close set of trade and economic relationships with Russia that helped Germany, rise up to be the kind of manufacturing powerhouse, that we've known under Angela Merkel and, that we've come to get used to. So that, we have to bear in mind that, first of all, Europe is a major loser here. And I'd argue we are as well, because, we were heavily invested in peace in Europe. In fact, we'd moved on. We've had not just pivots to the Middle East, but pivots to Asia. We wanted to concentrate on the rising threat of China. We did not think we were going to go back to this again, right? I mean, none of us, myself, I was kind of ready to move on, retool, the old Russia expert, finally, I can go off and, do something else, and suddenly, oops, no, we're all back into this game again, dusting off, all the kind of old books and files, and, trying to figure out, where we're headed. One could say that, we old, former Russia experts are now winners, but I actually think we're all losers, because, we all thought that we were on a totally different path. And I think this is a massive tragedy and a catastrophe. And then, as you're pointing out, obviously Ukraine is a massive loser in all of this, but also so is Russia, because Russia's just thrown its future, in my view, out the window here. And we can talk a little bit more about that. Other global players, as you're suggesting here, countries in Africa, Asia, Latin and South America that relied on Ukraine and Russia for grain and fertilizer, or fertilizer and grain, because fertilizer comes first. Because we now know that Russia and Ukraine and Kazakhstan, were together a good quarter of the global grain trade, and massive producers of fertilizer, along with Belarus, for all kinds of countries from Brazil to the Lebanon and elsewhere, and lots of countries that were already in a precarious position and facing famine have been plunged over into it as a result of this war. India, as you mentioned, is a major loser, because the Indians had been banking on the Russians to be the big equipment providers. They'd been modeling their own army on Russia. They were expecting to get a limitless supply of arms and spare parts, because they are stuck between Pakistan and China as adversaries, and they thought that Russia would be able to support them, where Russia's now all in with China because it has to be, and it's completely and utterly upset the balance. And I would actually argue that China is a bit of a loser as well, which might sound counterintuitive, because in many respects China looks strengthened by this. But think about what's happening in China at the moment. The zero COVID policy is flipped into a, oh my God, let's just try to get ourselves out of it policy, and it's having all kinds of horrible negative effects, as would have been expected. The Chinese economy has got very anemic growth, and China just announced that they're having a demographic turnaround. In fact, their population didn't grow for the first time in decades. So China is actually looking a little bit more precarious than it did, several months ago, and certainly than it did a year ago. And we've now got the spotlight on China and Taiwan in a probably uncomfortable way for China, because we just expect that if Russia's doing this to Ukraine, then why not China rather, taking a leaf out of Russia's book and doing this to Taiwan? So we're now all full on Taiwan. And I don't think China was quite ready for that, didn't want that to happen yet. They weren't, quite positioned in a way that they could take advantage of this. And also President Xi looks like he made a huge blunder by backing Putin. And China was heavily invested in Ukraine in its agribusiness sector. They were the second largest investor in Ukraine after the European Union. And they're all about sovereignty and territorial integrity, because that's why they don't want Taiwan going anywhere. And suddenly, they find themselves also embroiled in a war in Europe. And it's the kind of war that's changing the international system. And it might not change in China's interests either. So I think, here we've got a lot of big questions about how everyone comes out of this. But overall, this is a catastrophe and a tragedy for everyone. Although one can make an argument that, as I said, there are some winners in all of this, and actually one unexpected one would be Dubai, because every Russian oligarch has moved to Dubai, taking their cash with them. So Dubai is looking pretty flush these days, and I think they probably don't want the war to end anytime soon.
So kind of in line with that, how effective have the economic sanctions been against Russia? Are they, in your opinion, was this a good strategy? Is this a way to go, or are there other things we could have done other than economic sanctions?
Sanctions is always this. It's like, the tools that we got, let's use them, kind of thing. And every time something happens, we pull out the sanctions toolbox. And of course, there's all kinds of things that we could do, other ways of going about it. But, we reflexively move towards sanctions. And, if you look at sanctions, they're a real mixed bag. I always hesitate when I talk about them, because in some ways they have an effect, but in other ways they don't have the effect necessarily that we want, right? Because we think they're going to change behavior, and they don't really. What they do is they create a set of constraints, because Putin hasn't changed his goals. He hasn't, because he's sanctioned, thought, oh, right, okay, I'm going to stop the war in Ukraine. We can see that's not the case. But they do limit his options, they make it more difficult for him to pursue the war, can make it more difficult to get equipment. Everyone keeps, for example, and there are lots of the countries that normally be trading with are somewhat hesitant. Even China and India and others are being very careful not to rupture the sanctions because of the effects that they can have and the secondary, effects of the sanctions. We've seen, of course, that oil and gas continue to be sold by Russia, but we've got this cap on oil price. It's not a cap on the oil price per se, but it's a cap. It's a restriction, let's say, on the shipments of oil at a certain price. So we're allowing, shippers to move forward and getting them insured. And actually, we're seeing a lot of shippers moving back away from this now. If the oil price of the barrels that they're shipping is at $60 and below. And we're actually seeing that actually having an impact now, that it is actually restricting some of Russia's revenues. But some of the sanctions that were applied back in 2014, after the annexation of Crimea, the shooting down of the MH17 Malaysian Airlines, the war in the Donbass and all the rest of it, those have an effect because we're starting to see now that Russia's having equipment problems and that they're not having the microchips and some of the other technology that they need for maintaining their military capabilities. They've had to basically ground most of their airplanes and cannibalize the commercial fleet for the military fleet. So there are impacts there. It's just we can't really say yet how much they're going to constrain Putin's ability, to keep on with the war. He can probably still keep doing this for quite some time. What we do see is that they're really making a lot of the economic class in Russia very worried. And of course, we're all seeing now that there were a lot of businessmen opposed to the war. A lot of them are being assassinated. And the Russian government's even talking about confiscating the property and assets of people who've left the country and if they criticize the government. So, you can see that there's kind of knock-on effects from this. A lot of people who have been sanctioned individually, business people, not all so-called oligarchs, have been trying to get out of the sanctions and moving to Dubai, moving to other places and trying to kind of appeal to get out of it. But, Putin's basically saying to them, sorry, you're in this with the rest of us. And, if you don't like it, tough. In some cases, literally tough. Here's a window kind of thing. It's horrific, the various things that we're seeing here. But right now, it's going to take some more time before we really constrain Putin's ability to keep on going with this war.
So if we kind of maybe step back in time, is there something we could have done maybe 2, 3, even 10 years ago that might have prevented this, that wouldn't have jeopardized our security or Europe's security?
I think we should have just been mindful really from the very beginning that this was always a very strong possibility that, basically Russia might try to reclaim Ukraine under certain circumstances. And I say this because, I wrote with some other colleagues way back when in 1993, a report called Back in the USSR, obviously shamelessly cribbing from the Beatles, sounded, kind of good at the time, back in the early 1990s, documenting, in fact, a lot of the policies that were being pushed out of nationalist circles in Russia that were very threatening towards Ukraine and other countries. In fact, we said that there was a real risk of a lot of these things happening. And this is around the time when Russia, Kazakhstan and Belarus were being pushed by the United States to give up the nuclear arsenals that they had inherited from the collapse of the Soviet Union. And partly, as a result of all these machinations around this, and a lot of pressure that was already being put on Ukraine by Russian nationalists in the mayor's office in Moscow, Mayor Lushkov, the foreign ministry, the nationalist circles that now surround Putin in the presidency. The United States, the United Kingdom, and this is how we get ourselves all embroiled in this today, along with Russia, gave Ukraine assurances that if it gave up the nuclear weapons and sent them to Russia for being dismantling, that we would give them assurances of their territorial integrity, independence and sovereignty. Well, so much for that. But it's one of the reasons why the United States, the United Kingdom have stepped up, because we knew back in 1994 that there was a risk. And so, probably what we should have done there is give really fulsome guarantees and assurances. So we've kind of what we've done is just drop the ball all the time and take our eyes off it. We've been inconsistent. The Poles and the Balts have been, yelling and screaming about this for a long time. That's, why they wanted to join NATO. They've been saying, look, there's always this risk, there's these tensions, these pressures. They were right. The Finns and the Swedes, were always warning about this, but they didn't want to be in NATO at the time. The Norwegians, You know, those countries that have been closer to Russia and other former Soviet republics, Georgians, you know, Azeris, the Kazakhs, you know, at different times, the Moldovans, the Belarusians, even in, you know, times past, have warned of the pressures that they've been getting, Armenia as well, from Russia. And we haven't really taken it all that seriously. And what it would have undertaken was just a, you know, kind of a serious effort to stay on top of this all the time, and not, you know, this whiplash back and forth, you know, zigzag pendulum swings all over the place. When something happens, we react and then we forget about it. We kind of go back again. We never had it like in a dedicated task force. We didn't have consistency across administrations because we kind of assumed that the Russians had made a strategic choice not to do anything. But actually what had happened was they were too weak at times past. And there was always groups there who wanted to do something to reclaim parts of the former Soviet Union, but they didn't have the wherewithal to do it. And then you get to a situation with Putin that he has the wherewithal to do it. He's paid off all of Russia's debts, built the country up, basically built back up the military, and he has the will to do this, where other politicians, you know, might not. So we needed to be much more focused on all the warning signs all the way along. And Putin's been putting us on notice in 2007, 2008, that Ukraine, Georgia, and other places were in the crosshairs. And we just kept, you know, looking away and not paying sufficient attention. So we really needed to be dealing with this head on in the way that we actually did, somewhat belatedly, you know, in advance of the conflict, warning everybody that they're about to invade.
You mentioned a couple of these other Eastern European countries. Hungary has not been very critical of the war. I think I read an article just today that Slovakia may actually be leaning more towards supporting Putin. Is there have any feelings about that, or is that?
It's individual leaders. Look, one thing that Putin is extraordinarily good at is manipulating people. When he was always asked about, you know, what was the thing that he learned the most from, you know, his time in the KGB, he said working with people. In other words, you know, exploiting them. And so he's very good at targeting specific leaders and knowing their weaknesses and knowing who he can turn into, you know, what we used to call fellow travelers, people whose interests align with his. And Viktor Orban in Hungary is one of those people. Viktor Orban used to be, you know, on the kind of the left of this or center left of the spectrum, and he's now way over, you know, on the hard far right of the political spectrum, because that's what helped him get power in Hungary. I was actually on a young leaders program with Viktor Orban back in the day in the 1990s, and, you know, had a very different perspective, because that's what, you know, people were wanting to hear in Hungary in the immediate aftermath of, you know, the end of the Cold War. You know, now it's flipped in a different direction. He's become a definite fellow traveler of Putin, and the Russians have been, you know, propping up the Hungarian economy with cheap gas and oil, and Orban doesn't want to see the end of that. And also, I mean, I don't know quite what's happening in Slovakia at the moment, but Putin's got all kinds of tentacles into leaders in Czech Republic, Slovakia, Croatia, Serbia, Montenegro, you know, all over the place. He pretty much thinks he can buy people. And he literally does in some cases. You know, we know, of course, you know, Italian political leaders as well, Germany. You know, he's been working on this for 23 years of trying to figure out how he can basically manipulate and buy people off. And a week or so, maybe a month or so before the invasion of Ukraine in January, February of 2022, in various meetings that he had with Estonian and Finnish leaders, Putin was bragging that he'd bought Europe, and that if he ever did anything in Ukraine, nobody would react. Mm-hmm. So, you know, that's what he's banking on. He's banking on the fact that he can buy people off. And I don't mean buy like just here, have some cash, but, you know, buy all kinds of other inducements that make it kind of easier for them to gain power in their and retain power in their own states. He's kind of every autocrat's dream. He's basically propping up people that he sees who are like him.
So at this point, what are the prospects for this war ending? I mean, is Russia now so committed they can't give up? Is there an outcome other than full Russian withdrawal that Ukraine can live with?
We've got to work on that. I mean, I think, you know, you've hit the nail on the head. Russia's not going to give up. Putin's not going to give up. I mean, they may be constrained in such a way that they have to kind of give up some of the goals that are there. But ultimately, Putin wants to make sure he gets something out of this. I mean, so much blood and treasure, you know, spilled. He's not going to go back to just Crimea. after this very clearly in terms of demands. In fact, he said already that, yes, the war can end tomorrow if Ukraine accepts the new realities, which is that Russia has taken Crimea, the Donbass, Zaporizhia and Kherson. And, then you can negotiate over the terms of in which Russia has taken that and the terms of Ukraine's capitulation and surrender, which is why, as you point out, those are unacceptable terms to Ukraine, and Ukraine has said so. And in fact, we've just had reports in the paper that Bill Burns, the director of the CIA, has gone to Ukraine to talk to Zelensky about what they see as the next steps. And he's been very clear, as everybody else has, that there's no sign right now of any serious prospect for negotiation. But that does not mean that we should stop. And I do think that international diplomacy becomes very important, because what you're trying to do is constrain Putin's political room for maneuver. I think we've been able to see that although Putin's not necessarily deterrable in the actions that he takes, because if he thinks he can get away with them, he'll do them, but he can be dissuadable. And what I mean by that is we saw several weeks ago, and for months, obviously, Seb rattling about they were going to use a tactical nuclear weapon on the battlefield to do just what you're laying out, complete and utter surrender of Ukraine. And he kept talking about the precedent of Nagasaki and Hiroshima in 1945, the US using nuclear weapons to force the surrender of Japan, kept saying there's a precedent for this. And actually, he got a backlash behind the scenes, not just from the United States saying this was impermissible and acceptable and outrageous, and, the European allies, but also from China and India. They didn't like it. And there was the G20 meeting in Bali in Indonesia recently, and it's become very clear that the Chinese and Indians kind of took the Russians aside and said, can you stop this? And that, they've backed off. They're not talking about it quite so much. So we can say you can be dissuaded sometimes. And it wasn't just rhetoric. He was clearly trying to figure out, could he use a tactical battlefield nuclear weapon to get Ukraine to surrender and get the rest of us to go, oh, God, let's all pull back. And if you think about it, that's when all the calls for mediation and a resolution of this really started to mount, because people were saying it's unacceptable, to have any kind of threat of nuclear war. We need to end this right now. The Pope, for example, and many others stepping forward. That's what Putin's trying to do. He's trying to end this war on his terms. So we have to figure out, with the mixture of what we're doing already, the military support and economics and political support for Ukraine, with a full-on diplomatic effort. And it has to be multinational. Mm-hmm. What Putin really wants to do is actually sit down with the United States and negotiate Ukraine away, like at Yalta. And in fact, if we get to February, that whole kind of period of early February of 1945 was when Roosevelt and Churchill and Stalin were all sitting at Yalta. And of course, Churchill sends a little piece of paper to Stalin saying, these percentages of Eastern Europe under your influence, and some, directly there. And that's what Putin hopes for again. He still thinks in terms of spheres of influence. And that the United States is the dominant imperial power in Europe. And this is a battle with the United States for spheres of influence in Europe. And the United States should just pull back or go away entirely. And Russia should be allowed to dominate. And, I think we have a really hard time conceptualizing that Putin's still thinking like that. He's thinking in the terms that Germany thought about in World War I and World War II, and the terms of which, for centuries, great powers thought about all they had to do was have a conference and thrash it out about what they were going to be given in terms of territory.
Interesting. Germany's got a new defense minister. There's been some negotiation over sending tanks. And I think I heard that he said Germany would send tanks if the United States sends tanks. Is this a game of chicken, or what's going on there with that whole?
This is all about Germany. Germany having a really hard time. I just mentioned Germany caused 2 world wars, didn't it? And Germany's having a really hard time now trying to figure out what its new role is in this configuration, because we, of course, did occupy Germany after World War II. Germany was divided. And the United States and the other allies, United Kingdom and France, basically oversaw the pacification of Germany, the demilitarization of Germany in some respects initially. Although, once Germany was back in the fold and there was, kind of a building up of the German military in the context of NATO, the West German military during the Cold War. But our whole goal was to make sure that Germany could never do anything like this again in terms of invading other countries. And we made the constitution somewhat convoluted with so many checks and balances in that you wouldn't get militarism to return in Germany. So, in fact, we succeeded in a pretty spectacular way. Even the thought of sending tanks to Ukraine is too much for many Germans to contemplate. And then there's also the fact that at the end of the Cold War, the Germans really believed that they were in a time of perpetual peace. They really bought into the idea that nothing would ever happen again in Europe, nothing like this, certainly. And they're in a state of shock. And so trying to get their heads around figuring out how to take part in all of this when they were at the forefront of the Minsk efforts that were trying to reconcile between Russia and Ukraine and didn't get anywhere. And all of the mechanisms, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, NATO, the European Union, the Germans had all these dialogues with Russia on peace and people-to-people contacts. This is just the destruction of all of that post-World War II and Cold War policy for Germany. Mm-hmm. And I think that they're just in a bit of an existential angst moment at the moment, and they don't know what to do, which is like, no, you go first, please. Yeah. And we're hearing already that the Poles, who do have some of the Leopard tanks, are thinking or talking about sending one without Germany's permission to Ukraine to open the floodgates up. Because look, I mean, I don't think any country in Europe had fully appreciated that they would be back in a great war again. Right. And I mean, look, we're at remote, all kinds of levels remote from this. I mean, we talk all the time as if it's just us in the game. And, a lot of the debates that we're having, if we'd gone back to the World Affairs Councils, an equivalence after around World War I and World War II, they've been having the same debates. Isolation versus, being fully in the mix in Europe. Should they go in? Should they not go in? Remember, I mean, the United States pulled back from the League of Nations after World War I. World War II, if it hadn't been for Pearl Harbor, it's not likely that the United States would have gone in. They might have still continued with just supplying Great Britain with Lend-Lease. We had all these debates in the past, but the Europeans are there. And, if you talk to Europeans, that's how they talk. They talk in terms of World War I and World War II, particularly the Brits. Mm-hmm. Because, they kind of recognize we've been here before the Poles, for sure. Because remember, 1939, the war starts in Europe, but the German tanks going in. And if you're Belgium, I was last night with the Belgian ambassador. I mean, Belgium was marauded over twice in World War I and World War II, and all of World War I was fought in Belgium, in Flanders, and also in northern France. And so in many respects, this is a long, tradition of big wars being fought in very concentrated places. So the Belgians think, well, this is now Ukraine is having what happened to us in World War I. All the trench warfare and everything is happening there. So there's a different perspective for Europeans on what this is than perhaps there is here.
Yeah. I have kind of an opinion question here about the Russian people. The Russian people sort of have this historical, maybe mythical reputation for enduring suffering. Is this true? I mean, the United States is probably a place where we have war fatigue very quickly after several years of war. Are the Russian people really that tolerant of this kind of long-term suffering that they might go through?
Well, that's a really good question, because in World War I, it was that intolerance for the war that brought down the Russian Empire. The soldiers, were at the front. The Tsar was micromanaging the war, and they felt it was a disaster, and the soldiers left the front, and the whole Russian Empire collapsed. There were protests, left, right, and center. And World War II, this is the Soviet Union. So Ukraine was actually the scene of most of the fighting in World War II in the initial phases of the war, because when Nazi Germany moved through Poland, the next place it hit was Ukraine, which was, of course, part of the Soviet Union. So World War II was fought with the entirety of the Soviet Union. It was fought in the Caucasus and around, Azerbaijan and Baku, when the Nazis tried to aim for the oil fields there. Obviously we know about Stalingrad, which is, well into the, Russian interior in the Urals. But the whole Russian empire, now as the Soviet Union, was the scene of that fighting. So it's all those other people who suffered too. So when the Russians say, oh, only we suffer, what about Ukrainians and Belarusians? They were on the front lines of that war as well. That's basically what the Ukrainians are saying. You are invoking this language of the Great Fatherland War, is what they call World War II, but we were in that too. And now you are the aggressors against us. And World War II was a defensive war, right? The Soviet Union and the citizens of the Soviet Union are fighting for their own survival against an invader. Russia's the invader this time around. And in World War I, they weren't the invader either. It was the Germans who sparked off the war. They just got, dragged in because of all the alliances with Britain and France, for example. So this is unusual for Russia. I mean, the last time that they were an invader was Afghanistan. That was also the Soviet Union. And 14,000 soldiers died in Afghanistan. And now we think 100,000 soldiers have been killed and wounded in Ukraine. And Afghanistan, again, was the entire Soviet Union, including Ukrainians and Kazakhs and Armenians and everyone else. And this is just Russians. So this is already disproportionate. And Afghanistan was one of the factors that brought down the Soviet Union. I mean, not the only one, but it was one of them that did. And of course, Afghanistan and our wars in Afghanistan have done incredible damage to us as well, as a polity and, overall to our own economy. So, I think it's an open question, right? I mean, how much people want to suffer. And plus, Putin's age group may have suffered, but all the 20 and 30 somethings haven't. The last, 20 odd years have been, the best times for Russians. And so it's trying to find people who've got a memory of 1945. Good luck with that. Because, I mean, again, Putin's born in 1952. And younger Russians, they haven't lived in any particular hardship. And what Russia is doing, what Putin's doing, is he's taking the conscripts from the most hard scrabble parts of the Russian Federation, the marginal areas, the people who are non-Russians, who do live in considerable poverty, which is a classic imperial trick, right? It's the same in the United States and in the UK, that most of the soldiers come from the more marginal areas. They're not all coming from the kids of the elite. And so, I mean, I don't know whether Putin wants to test out whether all the kids of the elite are up for being on the battlefield. And I don't know whether he's entirely sure whether the whole population right now will rally around hardships from here to eternity.
Mm-hmm. So next week or 2 weeks from now, one of our programs is going to be on war crimes. And so what is the likelihood that Putin or some other generals in the Russian army are going to get charged with war crimes at some point in the future?
Well, it's possible that they might get tried in absentia, insofar through special mechanism as blamed for war crimes. But it's hard to envisage right now a Nuremberg trial scenario like we had at the end of World War II, because it's also hard to think of a kind of an absolute defeat for Russia. But I mean, I think what we're seeing in the United Nations context under the auspices of the Secretary General under Gutierrez, all kinds of mechanisms coming into play here for dealing with this. And there's the documentation of all the war crimes. There are lots of international lawyers working on this. You mentioned already, Betty, that a year ago you had Ambassador Makarova. The Ukrainian embassy and the ambassador herself have been heavily involved in setting up all investigative groups. We've got groups like Bellingcat, the investigative journalists who are actually now logging all of the evidence of atrocities. And quite different from, the case of World War II, where you were relying on some witness testimonies that, might be faulty over time, or documents that the Nazis had kept. We've got like every imaginable documentation here. We've got YouTube videos and Instagrams and TikToks, and you can geolocate these. We've got photographs, we've got satellites. I mean, you, me, and everybody, we could all take part in documenting atrocities. We could go onto YouTube and start collecting information. We can go onto Google Earth and, take a look at what's happening on the ground. We can all be, part of this. In fact, that's what Bellingcat is doing. They've got thousands of people around the world actually helping them document and collect information that's all out there on the internet. This is a war that's happening in real time that we're all witnesses of. We have so much more information about that war. I sometimes just have to cut it off because it just gets overwhelming. There's so much more information about this war than we've had of any other conflict. And we had a lot about Syria as well, and Afghanistan in the same way. But we weren't able to systematically capture all of the information because you've got, so many people who are very sophisticated in technology around the world helping the Ukrainians out, because you've also got the Ukrainians themselves, unlike Syrians, who are embedded in Silicon Valley, who are, high-tech experts. Putin, wasn't banking on any of that. So Ukraine, along with a whole host of helpers in the world, is busy documenting these war crimes. And I can imagine, special mechanisms and, special tribunals that are going to get set up for this. Because one of the things that they're trying to focus on, it's not just putting Putin and various generals on trial, or individual soldiers is highly likely, just like we've had in the Balkans, for example, Srebrenica, etc. But they're trying to get access, the Ukrainians are, to Russian funds, Russian assets that have been frozen from the central bank, etc., to use them for eventual reconstruction, reparations. So the war crimes is going to be tied to that.
All right. Well, that should be interesting to see how this plays out. And, like you said, there's so much video and recorded evidence available. So I
It looks
think
like you've got quite a lot of questions here. I can see hands and loads of things in the chat when I put my glasses on.
I want to encourage people, before you all came in, Dr. Hill has spoken before other World Affairs councils. She really likes all of our present, anybody who ever gives a president, we like to talk to audiences, and she would too. We'll ask your question, but if you would, we really would encourage you to ask your own. Don't give a statement. We don't have time for that.
Right. So Amy, if you could unmute everybody, and John Marcus had actually the first question up here. If John is still out there, if you want to ask your question, John.
I just wondered, you said there was 1 million Russians left, Russia. And I remember back in the 90s, I was where I was working, there were a bunch of Jews coming from Israel because the Russians would let them out if they said they were going to Israel. Well, it had been 80 years since the pogroms. There weren't any real Jews over there, because it's a traditional religion. So I'm just wondering, where are these millions going, and what is their excuse for getting out?
Well, there's actually various different ways in which this is transpiring. And actually, just to be very clear, there are actually quite a lot of Jews still in Russia. A lot of people went back again, in fact, after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And, the exodus that you're referring to was in response to the Jackson-Vanik legislation that the United States actually imposed on the Soviet Union. Basically, when they were refusing to let Jews leave the Soviet Union, the United States put all kinds of trade restrictions on the Soviet Union. And then eventually the restrictions were lifted. That's what you're referring to. And sort of like in the 80s and the 1990s, there were a lot of people left. And you're right, not everybody had, full Jewish heritage. Some had a grandparent, and a lot went to Israel, but a lot came here to the United States. And actually what's interesting is, just recently, Russia has actually tried to close down the office that was set up by the Israeli government to help with Jews leaving the Russian Federation, because they said they're trying to do it to stem the brain drain, because so many people were actually, rediscovering their Jewish heritage to get the heck out since the war started. So there's that exodus that's happened, people going to Israel and elsewhere. But in the million of people, these are Russians who do not want to fight in the war. So in the initial phase, tens of thousands of people were leaving. They were getting on flights, before the flights got cut off, and they were going to the West, Western Europe, Germany, Finland. I've Russian friends who were getting on trains and going to Helsinki, across the border. Some walked across the border to Latvia or to Norway. I've got loads of friends I could tell you who did this. More recently, when Putin declared a draft of all of the young men 18 to 27, although they've been enlarging this, you've had hundreds of thousands of people leaving. So yesterday or the day before, we had a meeting at Brookings with the Armenian ambassador, and the Armenia is a tiny country. 700,000 Russians moved into Armenia in the last several months. 40,000 stayed. There's 700,000 that were registered going to Armenia were off somewhere else as well. The Uzbeks and the Kazakhs have got hundreds of thousands. The Kazakhs told me they had like 400,000 or 500,000 Russians. I mean, if I added it all up, it's way over 1 million. But, the statistics that people are trying to capture here seem to suggest 1 million leaving. And they're in Armenia, they're in Azerbaijan, they're in Dubai, I mentioned before. They're going to Germany. They're going to Kazakhstan. Some people are coming to the United States, across the Mexican border. You might have been reading about this, because Mexico, Argentina, Venezuela, Cuba, all have visa-free regimes for Russia, so they don't need a visa. Israel the same. So, anywhere that the Russians can go to without a visa, they're going to. And it's showing that there is a great desire to get away from this war, not to be part of it. And as you said, I mean, there was people moving out in the 90s, but this is way beyond anything that we've seen. And as you mentioned before, with the pogroms in the 1880s and 1890s, we had a lot of Russian Jews leave the Russian Empire. So this is the latest wave of people leaving. Beginning of the Russian Revolution, the Soviet period, people tried to flee as well. But this is a real tragedy for Russia, because that's a million of the most capable, people, the most creative people. It's like the young male workforce. You don't recover from a million people like that just leaving the country.
I actually read an article the other day about a group of people taking over a resort town in Turkey. Several thousand Russians had moved into this town, and the locals were complaining about the spike in housing prices and so forth. So.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. Turkey's another place. I mean, it's wherever they don't have a visa, they don't have visas to Turkey either.
Yeah. Okay, Sherry, you were kind of next in line here. Are you out there? She actually had a couple of questions. You out there, Sherry? Maybe not. So
we want to read through Sherry's question then, if we can't find her.
Sure. Essentially, she was asking about the latest security package that the United States passed. Is this something that's going to be sustainable for us, or is this, the politics in Washington now is kind of on edge, I guess.
Yeah, and then I also see that she has a question that was a bit related to the question that John asked about the implications of so many Russians leaving, and she said in places like Georgia. I mean, just to add on to that bit quickly, obviously a lot of the neighboring countries that have had difficulties with Russia, like Georgians, are a bit worried about the implications indeed of having hundreds of thousands of Russians suddenly there, particularly young men of military age, and what the implications of that would be. So this is very destabilizing for the rest of the region. And of course, this is on top of 8 million Ukrainian refugees, often in similar places as well as 8 million people displaced internally. But in terms of the package, apparently one of the messages that Bill Burns was taking to the Ukrainians is that, it may not be sustainable over the long run, the United States support. And I mean, again, it's not just us, it's the Europeans too. But as you're rightly suggesting, we're going to have to watch very closely what the debates are going to be in Congress. Ukraine didn't have a blank check anyway, though people are saying, no blank check for Ukraine. I mean, I guess we're just messing about with the debt limit right now, so we're all over the place. I mean, this might just get snarled up, in our own domestic politics. And Europe's watching this very closely. It's not just Putin and everyone else. And just wondering whether the United States is going to be able to take the lead. And there's still a lot of support for helping Ukraine in the United States at the popular level. It just doesn't always translate into political support in the congressional level, because we're so much now, all of us, the victims of all kinds of crazy fighting on a partisan level in Congress. And I think the Europeans are watching this and then thinking, well, what should we do? Maybe we shouldn't wait around for the United States to bag out on all of this, and maybe we should be stepping up. Not the Germans, obviously, because the Germans are always waiting to see, what we're doing, but other European countries. The UK has announced, kind of a major effort. The Poles, the Balts, the Norwegians. I was just in Oslo last week thinking about what more they can do, for example, in conjunction with Sweden and Finland and other Scandinavian countries. So I think this is something we're just going to have to watch very carefully and see where it heads. But our politics are unpredictable at the moment. I mean, I also can't say how this is always going to play out.
Oh, thank you. Hey, I'm hearing a little feedback there. If you are not muted, would you please do so? Okay, Mel Miller, Mel, you out there?
Yes, thank you. First of all, I want to thank Dr. Hill for a very interesting book that she wrote. There is Nothing for You Here. I thought it was an excellent memoir. Also, Finland shares 2,000-mile border with Russia. What has been their reaction, and what are they doing on an internal basis to prepare for it? Because last time I was there was a feeling like there's no way they could compete, so they're just going on faith. Has that changed any in this latest round of aggression by Russia?
Yeah, I mean, the Finns are absolutely, as you're suggesting, on high alert now. And in fact, Finland and Sweden have both applied to join NATO, precisely because their feeling is that we're in a whole different realm now. They'd been hoping that, Russia wouldn't take these steps, but they'd always been building up their military and keeping their intelligence focus. They were warning, of kind of risks, but they were also trying to mediate and, work on the diplomatic level. The president of Finland, Sauli Niinistö, was one of the people who was regularly meeting with Putin, more than anyone else. And he said after the invasion, well, Putin lied to me every single time I met him because he was always telling them that they wouldn't do this. And one of the reasons the Finns have decided to join NATO, which is completely contrary to their whole policy after, World War II and during the Cold War, is that what they saw, of course, is that the Russians massed troops on the Ukrainian border, said it was exercises, said they had no intention of invading, and invaded. And that's what the Soviet Union did to Finland in 1941. Finland had got its independence at the end of the Russian Empire and the end of World War One, and then the Soviet Union came right back in again, said, sorry, same thing with Ukraine. You still belong to us. And the only way that Finland got its full independence again was by losing huge swathes of territory. So most of the area around St. Petersburg, Karelia, all of that area on the other side of the Finnish border used to be Finland. And basically, Finland lost their winter war, but they kind of managed to fight the Russians off. And they got away, but without a lot of territory. And they assumed that that's what the Russians are trying to do with Ukraine as well, because Russia wanted to reincorporate Finland, or the Soviet Union did in 1941. So Finland sees the writing on the wall, and also the nuclear saber rattling. I mean, they're not a nuclear power. And Sweden, ironically, was leading the charge of the United Nations to ban nuclear weapons, and was in a bit of a tussle with the United States about this a few years ago. And now Sweden wants to join NATO because of nuclear weapons and the nuclear umbrella. I mean, you couldn't have a bigger change than you had before. And the Swedes admit it, and they kind of look a bit embarrassed and look down like this a bit, like, oops, because the world has changed in such a dramatic fashion that they can't continue in the way that they did before. So Finland and Sweden, all the decisions now are being very much shaped by what's happened. And the Finnish President Niinistö said as well to Putin, if you want to look at the reason why Finland wants to join NATO, just look in the mirror.
Okay, thank you. Adrian, you had a question relative to climate crisis. Are you out there? You want to elaborate on your question a little bit?
Yeah, sure. First of all, I just want to say thank you for the thoughtful discussion and all the expertise and experience that you're bringing to the presentation tonight, Dr. Hill. So my question is putting this into a larger global context, because I really don't understand why climate isn't the overarching concern of everyone at this point. So my question is, I'm wondering, how might the continuing worsening climate crisis affect the resolution of this conflict? Thank you.
That's really, a great question. In fact, one of the things that I should have said at the outset when Ray was asking about winners and losers is that, climate change policy is to a large extent a bit of a loser right now, because all of the attention, as you're rightly suggesting, is now on this war and this conflict. And it becomes very apparent that Putin doesn't care, and that, with the devastation of Ukrainian agricultural capacity, we're exacerbating problems even further. All the explosions, the damage to infrastructure and facilities, the threats to the nuclear plants in Zaporizhia, Chernobyl, which raises a lot of questions about the future of nuclear power, which is one of the power generation capacities that we actually need to make a transition away from hydrocarbons. And of course, Putin's making it impossible for us to work with them and the Russians and the Chinese and others on this very vital and important topic, when all we're trying to do is try to figure out how to get this war to stop. So absolutely, this is a major problem. However, there could be an upside to this, even though it's hard to see these, in the fact that what Putin has done is really accelerated the thinking in Europe away from reliance on Russian gas and oil, and starting to think much more about renewables and how European energy security can change. And again, I was in Norway last week, where Norway's thinking about this a lot, because Norway suddenly has become the largest supplier of gas to Europe. And the Norwegians aren't super comfortable with that. When you look at Norway itself, it doesn't use a lot of its own gas. A lot of Norwegian electricity is generated by hydropower. So they actually have a lot of clean energy and clean hydrogen, and they're starting to kind of feel a bit of the guilt that they're, making money hand over fist by selling large amounts of gas. They've just signed contracts with the Germans, the Brits, and others. And the Norwegian government, they have this big sovereign wealth fund, and they're all now starting to think about how they can start investing more of the sovereign wealth fund into thinking differently about the energy mix in Europe and working more closely with other European players. They're not members of the European Union, but there's a lot of thinking in Norway about what can we do to address this, because Norway is very worried about climate change. Just like many other European countries are, retreat of glaciers, the way that climate affects, their ability to grow their own food. Ukraine was vital, in terms of thinking about global food security over the longer term. We've got to rethink of the way that we think about food production, because, part of the issue in Ukraine is fertilizers and the blockade on fertilizers. And all our fertilizers are made, as you well know, by the fixing of nitrogen through large uses of methane gas. So 70% of food production is fuel, often coming from gas, used in fertilizers, the ammonium phosphates, fuel for farm equipment, fuel for shipment. We've got a lot of thinking to be done here. And this war has put a spotlight on a lot of the vulnerabilities. So that, in combination with all the other reports that are coming out about just in what dire situation we are, along with all the environmental disasters that we're seeing, I think is now concentrating people's minds. But the war then becomes an obstacle to actually tackling this in a holistic fashion, because we need Russia to tackle this too. Russia is one of the greatest, along with the United States, frankly, emitters of methane and associated gas from flaring. And if they can't sell their gas, they're probably going to flare it. And then, of course, we know there's the melting of the permafrost, and more methane being exposed that way, because the permafrost acts as like a capstone, keeping natural gas methane inside. So as that melts, it always gets released. I mean, it's a mess. We had a whole episode recently where you could see bubbling up of methane gas coming up of the captive sea up in the Arctic because of melting in the sea. Not just, the destruction of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline and gas being exposed that way. So you're absolutely right to put the spotlight on this. And, I really hope that people's minds get concentrated by this war, that there might be an opportunity to do more out of this.
Yeah, we're going to actually take your passport back because you're saying methane instead of methane.
I know. And it's funny now because I say aluminum instead of aluminium.
There you go.
I'm just like, when I go to Britain, they went, what did you say? So I get myself confused. Issue, schedule. Like there's all these like really funny little, and I'm just a mess. I'm a mess.
All right. Okay. Brandon Nolte, you had a question? You out there, Brandon?
Yeah.
Hi, Brendan. You've had your hand up for a while. I could see you waving.
I've been dreaming about asking you a question for the last 20 years.
Oh wow!
Maybe not the specific, but I'm a big follower. So earlier you touched on the question around larger geopolitical alignments and how their kind of rewiring is occurring, I guess is how I would phrase that. Question. The India-Russia relationship. Indians have been, as I understand, a very constructive partner through this larger situation. Would there be an appetite to have a conversation around bringing India as well as Pakistan into a potential realignment around arms supplies in exchange for some degree of cooperation between the two? Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's very interesting. I mean, I think a lot of people are scratching their heads about what to do about this, because obviously, as you're rightly suggesting, India was really reliant on Russia before for its security. That goes back to the Soviet period when there was a special Indian-Soviet friendship. Lots of Indians studied in the Soviet Union. You might remember at the very beginning of the war, the Indian government was fixated on getting tens of thousands of Indian students out of Kharkiv in Ukraine, because, even after the end of the Soviet Union, Indian students kept going to the constituent parts, Kazakhstan, Ukraine, Armenia, kind of following these long traditions, not just of collaboration with Russia itself, but with the other parts of the Soviet Union. And India modeled its armed forces, not on the British armed forces, over recent terms. I want to get been there, done that, thank you very much. But focusing, much more on the Russian armed forces and the way that they conducted themselves. And then, of course, Soviet era and now Russian military equipment. The S-400s, for example, India was trying to buy those, the defensive weapons that we were always fighting with Turkey about because they wanted to buy them. And this is a real nightmare, as you're pointing out, for India. But India's really worried about Pakistan because China was encouraging Pakistan to have a rapprochement with Russia. And, so India doesn't really know where to turn at the moment. So, some room for creativity is there. Because as you said, India's tried to be somewhat helpful, and they were very helpful in Indonesia, in Bali for the G20, basically telling the Russians, no, on nuclear weapons. And this is a time for peace, not for war, which is what Prime Minister Modi said, and the foreign minister's been pretty outspoken on all of this. But there's so neuralgic about Pakistan and China and the linkages between them. And now they're extraordinarily worried that Russia's all in on China and they don't know what to do about it. So there's definitely some room there for creativity, but it's not kind of clear in what direction, because right now India continues to abstain in the United Nations because they're just so worried about getting crosswise with Russia, on top of their very, very difficult relationship with China, because there's been these clashes in the Himalayas between China and India of their disputed borders where people have been killed quite recently, and clashes again just in the last couple of months. So we would really have to think about how we help India across the board, and one of those items is indeed about arms sales. And Pakistan, of course, used to be an ally of ours. They're not even a frenemy at this point. I think we're kind of completely on the outs with Pakistan. And we'd have to really kind of think about how we manage all of that. But it's a really good, idea to put all of these out there, because that's, getting back to what I said before, we need creative thinking in diplomacy, because we're going to be in this for the long haul. And I think it's not just on the battlefield that this is going to get ended, getting back to where Ray was asking before, but it's in the diplomatic field as well, and in the United Nations, level of the General Assembly, these special mechanisms of the United Nations Secretary General, and other countries kind of pushing Russia, not just the United States and European allies.
It definitely feels, to your point, it feels like there's an appetite from everybody to at least check Russia's behavior, right? And like even today we saw, I don't know if this was connected to Dr. Burns' trip to
Ukraine. Yeah, he went to Ukraine.
Right. But we saw Serbia and Iran both acknowledge that Crimea is Ukrainian and that Russia should not be invading. And I would have never guessed you'd see those two break off, whereas Hungary seems to have doubled down on their pro-Russian stance.
Yeah, because Hungary would like bits of Ukraine, like Uzhhorod, where the Hungarian speakers are. And I think Iran is worrying, about its own territorial integrity. And, obviously, Serbia would like Kosovo back. There's a lot of stuff going on there, that everybody's looking at this and thinking, hang on. We're getting back to what Ray said before. This isn't always in my interest, even though it looked like it might be at the surface.
Yeah. So any way to pull Pakistan, my.
I can't believe he's having his own private conversation here.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, we had a couple of other people here, Brandon. I appreciate that.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Nick Idy, I think I had you up next, and then Bowden, I'll get to you, and then Audra.
Yes, my question was in relation to the discussion about effectiveness of sanctions. And I think I read in the Washington Post a day or two ago that the Russian Statistical Bureau, or whatever they call themselves, said that their GDP contracted only it was 2 or 3%. Do we really believe that? That seems kind of hard to believe.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right there, Nick, to flag that. I think that we probably don't have any real sense of the data now. And, you think about what happened in China as well before the big Party Congress, they didn't really reveal a lot of their own figures, and they waited until afterwards because, you know, they weren't quite at the level that everybody was anticipating. I mean, there's a lot of incentive for Russia to, you know, basically play down the impact and play up their economic success. So, you know, this was something we saw in the Soviet period. You had to kind of triangulate and cross-reference all kinds of statistics. But I think we should be somewhat skeptical. Absolutely right of that.
Yep, great, thanks.
Bowden.
Thank you very much. I follow Dr. Hill's presentations wherever I can, and they're really excellent. And English is not my first language, so I can say that she does give very good analysis, even from the Ukrainian point of view, which is sometimes they're a little bit impatient on this. But I have a very simple question, and I don't know if you can answer this. But can you just address the idea of redevelopment of Ukraine, the rebuilding of Ukraine after this war? And is there an opportunity to tie it to sustainable development so that Ukraine becomes a model, you know, a laboratory, then a model, then an expert, then a leader in sustainable development? Would that be a reasonable strategy?
I think, Bogdan, yes, absolutely. And I mean, it gets back to what Adrian was saying, you know, earlier about climate and, you know, other, you know, factors that we should be really thinking about. Ukraine, as you well know, I mean, I recognize immediately you must be of Ukrainian heritage, has been the breadbasket of Europe for centuries. And in fact, we've realized that Ukraine is the breadbasket for the world. And one of the areas that is going to have to be tackled right away in reconstruction is the restoration of the agricultural sector in Ukraine and agribusiness. And all of the major US companies, the John Deere's, Monsanto's and others, were invested in Ukraine before the war, and they were stepping up their investments. And China was a major investor in Ukraine in its agricultural sector, not just in manufacturing, before the war as well. I talked about fertilizer. You know, we could rethink the way that fertilizers are produced. There's all kinds of ways in which there could be experiments on that in Ukraine. Of course, I mean, one of the horrible things about all of this is that, you know, the deliberate use of cluster bombs, and there's so many horrible things obviously about the war, but the deliberate destruction of Ukraine's agricultural capacity. I mean, the mines all over, fields, you know, just like we saw in places like Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, you know, and other places after conflicts with lots of mines being laid. We're going to have to do a lot of demining, first before we can move along with our plans. But I think there's an enormous opportunity to showcase all the things that we've learned in development over, you know, the last decades elsewhere in the world, in Ukraine itself. And Ukraine's got a great capacity. One of the ways, you know, would be to harness the incredible energies of Ukrainian people. I mean, one thing that all of us have seen during this conflict is Ukrainians themselves really believe in the future of the country, and that there's an incredible amount of independent agency and energy and a willingness to fight for the country, just like there will be to rebuild afterwards. A lot of companies that have pulled out of Russia, when I've talked to CEOs, and I've been doing a lot of talks to, you know, big Fortune 500 and above companies and multinationals, I in addition to talking to the Norwegian government last week, I was talking to the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund, some of their big investment funds are all eager to move into Ukraine. They were already pulling out of Russia, frankly, even before the war. Some of the big manufacturers, and we had all this, you know, talk all the time about corruption in Ukraine. There was also a lot of opportunity, you know, for developing greenfield businesses, particularly in the high tech sector, engineering, agriculture, high tech, the IT software development. There's just so much potential in Ukraine. So I think you're absolutely right. And the big issue is going to be how to pull that all together, how to get, you know, governments and the private sector and development agencies all working together on this. And I've already heard about a lot of funds that are being set up by, you know, kind of big equity investors and, others to try to set up special funds for driving Ukrainian reconstruction.
All right, thank you. Sounds like a massive problem, another Marshall Plan.
Yeah, and but being more creative about it, because, you know, Marshall Plan is just sort of a transfer of money, you know, but this could also be know-how and, you know, thinking about it, how it might integrate in a different way. I mean, this could be a big boon and a boost for the whole of Eastern Europe, you know, with Ukraine being able to really develop all of its, connections with its neighbours as well in ways that it wasn't able to before. And plus, Ukraine's got the prospect now of joining the European Union.
Yeah. Okay, Audrey, you got a question?
Yes, and I was able to unmute, so that's excellent. Thanks.
Yeah.
Just a quick one. I had a couple of, one was about NATO, but you've talked a bit about that. It's more about the perspective that you might be getting on what people are hearing and being able to hear and learn in terms of real information in Russia about the war. You've talked about, you know, connections with countries around there. Early on in the war, we heard a lot of things about how some people were able to find out what was going on in the face of all of the media restrictions through internet, VPNs, the phone calls from Russian soldiers saying, you know, no, what they're telling you isn't what we're seeing. But I've not seen so much of that in the media anymore. Any thoughts on how much of real information is getting in, and if so, how?
Yeah, I mean, look, there's all the people that left, you know, that we were talking about earlier, calling back home, and but you know, I think it's also quite difficult. YouTube is one source. There's an enormous amount of material on YouTube. It hasn't been blocked yet, but I think there's also a lot of people trying to pretend it's not happening unless it's directly affecting them. I mean, I've spent a lot of time in Russia over the years, and I know from being there during awful things happening, people would just say, look, I can't do anything about it. You know, I'm just going to put the blinkers on.
Yep.
I've seen it time and time again. Look, we're all guilty of that too. Oops.
Hey, guys, mute yourself.
Yeah, I mean, I get information overload as well. I'm sure, I mean, everybody does write about things, because there are some things that you really can't do anything about. So you kind of try to switch off because it just becomes devastating and overwhelming. And I think a lot of Russians, because I've interacted with a few, and I've been very careful about my friends, as I said, quite a few people have left, but some of them I've just stopped really contacting, because I think, God, will I get them into trouble, particularly, you know, because people know who I am, you know, and if I'm on WhatsApp with them, you know, what if they get into trouble? I'm not going to start asking them, you know, questions. But I think, you know, a lot of people, you know, also just don't know what to do about all of this, and, you know, don't know whether it's kind of worth their while to be trying to find out information. You know, they feel kind of helpless.
Yep.
You know, they're not all in on all of this. And it's hard to gauge. It gets back to when Ray was asking before about, you know, what do we know really about public opinion? I think there's limits to what we know. I mean, I really do. And, you know, you think about all of us. I mean, how did we all feel about, you know, the war in Iraq or Afghanistan? If your family member is there, you're thinking about this 24/7. Any of your family members, right? But if you're not, and your degrees of separation, and you don't have a neighbor or a friend or anything who's embroiled in things, you know, same in World War I and World War II. You know, for the most part, people could, you know, get along with their lives. And I think a lot of Russians are not being affected.
Especially the ones in power. I think that goes back to what you were saying before. The people where they are getting the conscripts from are less enfranchised.
Exactly. So if you're in Buryatia, we know that a lot of people are very angry, because we see protesting. You see those on YouTube as well. You know, the Buryats are, you know, basically an indigenous group from in the sort of Urals and Siberia. They're one of the groups, because they're so impoverished in this area, they're all being sent en masse, and they're complaining and they're protesting against it. And they are getting information, because they're getting information from their kids in the field. But it's, you know, I think Putin himself is not really sure what people know. I mean, he's trying to mobilize now and trying to get his narrative to be the only narrative out there and to drown the others out. So we're going to have to, you know, watch very closely about what they clamp down on, because we see that in China, right? I mean, they know that there's such a vast population, they can't keep them all in the dark. You've got WeChat and all these other ways that people have about finding information, and then the Chinese really clamp down. So, you know, will Russia start to clamp down because they get worried?
Yeah, actually, Claire Collins, are you out there? You had a question kind of related to this. Claire, are you out there?
Yes,
Go
I'm
ahead.
here. Okay. I was just wondering, I mean, Putin is acting like Adolf Hitler, and, you know, if you studied all the isms, you know, he's a typical fascist, and he's claiming that everybody, you know, who opposes him is a fascist. And I was just wondering, are the people in Russia really believing him when, you know, he says he's fighting fascists?
Some people do. And there were instances in the early part of the war, the invasion, of Russian, soldiers. We get these reports from the Ukrainians saying where the fascists tell us where the Nazis are, and then realizing that there's no one there. And that actually was one of the reasons lots of people fled the field. A lot of the conscripts and others taking off because they realized that they were being told a pack of lies. And you're kind of getting that coming out of the Russian military through various intercepts. The Ukrainians, remember, listening into all of their cell phones and cell phone coverage. I mean, that gets back to all the things that we've just been talking about there. Some people have talked themselves into believing that around the people in power, around the Kremlin. But I think a lot of people just don't believe that. But they now are starting to believe the idea that they've got an existential threat because they're fighting the West. And we have to be very careful about that. Because basically the next phase of the narrative is that Russia's fighting the United States, Russia's fighting NATO, Russia's fighting the West. And this is just the big showdown in Ukraine. So he's flipped the rhetoric because he's trying to mobilize the people behind him. So if Nazis and fighting the Nazis and refighting World War II is not going to work, he's going to try to throw, the next set of ideas. He's trying to mobilize the population behind what is now evidently a war and saying it's all about a war with the West. And he might get some traction with that. Because a lot of people do still see things in that, black and white, old us versus them, East versus West terms.
All right, we're coming up on 8:30 here. I think we have time for one more question. Bruce Frank, are you out there? You had an interesting question.
Yeah,
Bruce?
yes, I am. Dr. Hill, first, I watched the impeachment trials and wanted to say how impressed I was with your testimony, that you set an example for that. And second, you had a quote there where you said you were doing diplomacy in support of the United States and Giuliani was doing politics in support of Donald Trump. Could you explain that?
Yeah, I mean, look, every administration, every president that comes in has their own take on things and their own policies. But if you really look at things behind the scenes, there's a heck of a lot of continuity in US policy on all kinds of topics. It's just, everybody wants to kind of jazz it up normally and, put their own stamp on it. But in this particular case, that stamp was extraordinarily personal. It was all about President Trump getting reelected. And, when you think about the phone call that precipitated that first impeachment trial, and you think about what's happened now, basically what the president was doing was withholding a visit to the White House, which would have been a big boost to Zelensky. And look, we've got people like flying all over to.
No. I think you froze up, Fiona. Oh, no. I think we lost you at the very end here. I'm so sorry.
Ray, you tried. Thank you.
Yeah, we tried.
On personal interests with politics, and we've got to, basically root that out and push back against it. But this was, unfortunately, one of the more egregious examples of that. And what I was trying to explain at the time is that there's these long threads of US policy where most people are on the same page on national security, but sometimes we see other people just doing things in support of their own personal interests, and that was really kind of what was at stake there. And Putin, just to use this as a segue, this is what he looks for all the time. He always looks to what can he do to manipulate and take advantage of people's weaknesses and vulnerabilities and their own personal agendas. Putin just believes that nobody's altruistic. He's just got deep cynicism. He doesn't believe that anybody does the right thing. He just believes that everyone can be manipulated for power, influence, money, lust, you name it. He's the man who believes in the carnal sins and that everybody just indulges in them. He believes in our devils and not our better angels. And so he'll look at every time for anything that anyone's doing wrong and try to take advantage of it. And so that made us incredibly weak and vulnerable. That's the message I was trying to get across. And also, in terms of the rest of the world, they're still wondering, whether we're serious about things or whether we're just all fighting out our own personal agendas. Sad to say. And look, Zelensky himself, before this war, there was a lot of criticism about him. People wondered if he was just, you know, kind of on his own personal hobby horses, former actor, tied into oligarchs and, you know, rich business people in Ukraine. He'd worked in Russia for a long time. His popularity was pretty low. And now look at him. You know, people are, this is the Winston Churchill of our time. You know, so I mean, he's definitely out there representing Ukraine and not his own personal agendas at this particular point, because he rose to the occasion. You know, and that's, you know, basically what I was trying to get across too. There's times when you have to put your personal stuff aside and rise to the occasion. And, you know, every Ukrainian's being forced to do that right now. And, you know, we should be out there trying to support them, not asking them for personal favors.
Thank
All
you.
right. Well, Fiona, thank you so much. This was a great evening. I appreciate you taking the time to join us tonight.
Thank you, great.
Some terrific insights into what's going on.
And thank you to everybody for all of the chat things. Now I put my glasses on, I could see there was lots of different questions, and you know, thank you so much for such a nice Indiana welcome. I've got relatives in Indiana, in places like Muncie and various things, you know. So, you know, I'd like to get out there in person. So next time, let's do this in person.
Yes. Yes, we would love that. I was thinking that we've enjoyed being able to have the virtual programming opportunity. You know, we've all heard the expression, an idea whose time has come. And we did Skype and clunking around with other things, and Zoom was just there when COVID hit, and it was an idea. I mean, it was just magic. We all tried to learn it as quickly as we could. Of course, we still don't know how to unmute ourselves after 3 years.
Yeah. I do that all the time.
And we're still freezing. You know, you froze at one point at the very, very end. I thought,
yeah,
well,
I thought I did. It said that awful message says your internet connection is unstable.
I know.
And it gave me some warning that it was about to do some kind of new update. I had to go, oh no, because you might have seen me sometime trying to click something away. Are you ready for your update? No, I'm not. Stop.
Well, we are. It's just nice to know that all of us have that same problem. I just had my tech company come out and just do some upgrades in my home personally and put stuff on my second floor so I would stop freezing. So thank you. I mean, this has been fantastic. I'm going to remind everybody that we did record it. So you will be able to watch this, and you'll probably want to send it on to people who come, who are not able to come. It does also tell me, though, that in the old days when we were still in person, we love the fact we know there are people with us this evening that are not just here in central Indiana. And of course,
yes, I can see people from Kansas City and Ventura County, California, New Hampshire. Great. Yeah, lots of people going, no, don't stop completely. We'll all have to go to Indiana.
No, absolutely. So we're trying to figure that out. If we could do hybrid really smoothly. And of course, you know, Dr. Hill, we have you, and we have these wonderful speakers such as yourself that our small little council would not really be able to afford to have. And so we can bring you to Indiana. And so it's got its ups and downs. If we were still in person, we would be hanging out in the room and be asking you more questions, and people would be keeping you there till midnight, and maybe we would go to the bar and carry on the conversation there. So we kind of miss that. We're trying to figure out, our council's trying to figure out how we can do maybe something along those lines, even still twice a year. So hang with us, you know, come to our website, visit us and see how we're trying. If we're going to do a hybrid, we really want to do it smoothly so it doesn't look clunky, you know, and actually, we're working with a very, very sharp high school here in the Indianapolis.
Yes, that's the best way to go. They'll know exactly what to do.
I know, yes, because we won't, you know. So we're going to put it in their hands, and I'm sure they'll figure out something very good for us. And so we're looking, you know, forward to that. But do stay tuned with us. We are looking for something where maybe twice a year we could do something again along programming where we can bring somebody in live and we can be in person. And so, but thank you. I noticed that somebody had said spasiba. And I recognize the interconnection between the Slavic languages, and some of those words are still very recognizable. So it's Ochin spasiba. Thank you very much.
Spasiba, yeah. No, dziękuję in Ukrainian as well. So there we go.
Yes, yes. So it was just.
We've got all kinds of different languages. Bogdan can give us all instruction. You know, the correct, kind of correct way of thanking everyone.
Well, thank you. We want you to come back to us in 1 month because our next program for distinguished speakers, we're going to go to another part of the world. We're going to be going to Africa. And we're going to have the ambassador from Rwanda, the United States, Ambassador Bukantabana, who's going to talk about U.S.-African Union relations. 52 countries in Africa, and they vary as much as you can imagine. I think many of you have seen those maps of Africa where you're putting different corners of other large, massive land areas in the world into Africa, and the U.S. kind of fits up in what would be the Northwest section, not even a quadrant, because we don't even fill up a quarter of it. So it'll be a good program. That is Thursday, 16th of February, the same time. So please come back. One of the big issues we did talk about tonight was war crimes. And we have a program, Distinguished Great Decisions, the other major program series for our council, for the Indiana Council of World Affairs, and for all councils across the country. America's oldest public discussion forum, all long running, is called Great Decisions. And in association with the Foreign Policy Association, Dr. Hill mentioned our narrow views after World War I, and it emanated from the beginning of our own country, and how the Foreign Policy Association, in alignment also with WACA later, the World Affairs Council, played a major role in bringing these public forums to the public to address that isolationism, so that people wouldn't think we don't want to be involved in that, but how do we do that? It's going to be on war crimes. We are going to have that evening Aaron Farrell Rosenberg. That'll be war crimes against humanity, but how can they be prosecuted? And does the prosecution really matter? People are already asking questions such as, you can prosecute, but does it really matter? Does it stick? Aaron Farrell Rosenberg has worked extensively with The Hague on this issue. She's a visiting scholar with the Irvin Morgan Institute for Human Rights at the University of Cincinnati College of Law. That will be January the 31st. Once again, you do need to register to get your Zoom link. You all are used to that. We look forward to your coming. And Dr. Hill, if you want to join us that evening, that would be great. Well, I don't know where your daughter will be with her basketball tournament. We talked about that earlier. She came sliding in. She's like, gotta get my daughter, gotta pick her up. And she's in a basketball tournament. And I thought, this is a real woman. She lives just like us. And so hopefully you can maybe join us. We'd love to have you come back. Again, thank you all. This has been a fantastic evening. Great questions. It's a turning of incredible events in history. It's got the world on edge. And we'll see what happens, particularly with the new Congress. And you're right. I mean, there's interest waning. What will happen? Democracy is at stake. We will see. But thank you. You were wonderful. Thank you so much. And I thank you all for coming.
Thanks so much to everyone. All the best.
Yes.
Amy, you can end the program.